So our next presentation is by Tom Almendinger, and he's going to drill down a little bit further into our theme and address the impacts of deer herbivory on regeneration and possible solutions to this at a regional scale. So Tom Almendinger is the Director of Natural Resources and Agroecology for the Duke Farms Foundation. At Duke Farms, he has developed and continues to direct a large-scale landscape restoration program on 2,740-acre property that includes a range of habitats for fostering nearly 30 species of wildlife listed as threatened and endangered in the state of New Jersey. His natural resources team hosts a number of applied research projects in partnership with research universities, institutions, private firms, and other foundations around the country. Tom serves on the technical advisory board for the Rutgers University Eco Preserve, the New Jersey Invasive Species Strike Team, the Hutchison Memorial Forest at Rutgers University, and is also the past vice president of the New Jersey Wildlife Society. He's also a certified ecologist through the Ecological Society of America. He holds an MS in ecology and evolution from Rutgers University, and his research interests include plant-herbivore interactions, particularly between overabundant white-tailed deer and invasive plants, restoration of degraded habitats, conservation of threatened and endangered species, and sustainable agriculture as it relates to habitat and ecosystem services. So today, Tom will be presenting a talk entitled Restoring Forests Through Effective White-tailed Deer Management. So please join me in welcoming Tom.
Good morning, everybody. Since I'm the outlier, I'm in New Jersey, I just wanted to welcome you. Thank you for having me join your group. I think what I'm going to talk about today is very relevant to what you will be experiencing in your areas. We are potentially one of the worst places in the Northeast for overabundant deer, and I'll get into the details of that. As you were told, it's talks to be called Restoration Through Successful White-tailed Deer Management, aka most bang for your buck. But as Bill alluded to, if we were just focusing on bucks, we'd have no success. We also target breeding age females over the last 18 years of management. We began in earnest 18 years ago. And since then, we have a 3-to-1 ratio of doe to buck harvest, and the numbers really show. This is a 1930 aerial of the property. And as you can see, most of the forest had been cleared at this point, and the soils were filled, AKA disturbed. The wetlands were drained by our wealthy benefactors to utilize the land better, according to him. And beginning in the 1970s, white-tailed deer populations began to explode beyond our biological carrying capacity. This is a more recent aerial view, and as you can tell, all those beautiful farm fields that were once agricultural lands have been easily developed into sub-developments and industrial developments to our south. And I'll refer back to the slide before, if you can, I'll head back to that one. Let's see. If you look, there are only several pieces of forest land that existed in the 30s. And those are the areas that we have chose to focus most of our restoration efforts forest-wise because of that lack of forest disturbance and soil disturbance. Just a kind of example of where we are, and as you know, we are in a very highly developed area of the Northeast, if not the United States. We're probably the most densely populated. We are the most densely populated state in my entire life, throughout my entire life, and in one of the most densely populated counties. So if you look below the M, E, and part of the O is Duke Farms. And as the years progressed from 1972 to 2001, you can see how urbanization has occurred around us. So we've become sort of an oasis, but we do have some connectivity to a very large forest called the Sauerland Mountain region, which is the green section to the southeast of us, southwest of us. And we are working on corridors to Bill's talk. We do not obviously have the predators that Bill might have. We have very limited black bear. We have wanderers. We do have a very abundant population of coyotes, which do help us with some of our management. So where do we begin? Before I started 20 years ago at Duke Farms, the staff was requested by Miss Duke at the time to over the decades to feed deer during winter months to bolster their populations and to keep them healthy. There was never any real deer management had ever occurred on their property. And I heard Bill talk about 30 deer per square mile. I would die for 30 deer per square mile. We started with in 2004 with 250 deer per square mile, and some areas were higher. Deer were beginning to suffer from malnutrition and beginning to die. You know, all these cascading effects when I first started there were very noticeable. The habitat values were horrible. Common species of fauna that were lacking due to degraded habitat, like wood thrush, ovenbird, and small mammals and salamanders were non-existent. It looked like a Serengeti, honestly. Some of the large 200-acre fields we had, you could glass over 200 deer from one site. And as a 4 square mile property, we shouldn't have more than 60 deer, as far as that 15 deer per square mile target goes. So 250 per square mile or 1,000 deer was quite overabundant. So this is just a snapshot I took one day out in a large field, and there's 30 deer in about 5 acres. And that's enough for about half of our property, about 2 square miles, and that's on 5 acres. Stephen Horsley is a forester from Western Pennsylvania, and this is a great quote. This is not a new one, but it's fairly recent. The current density is producing devastating and long-term effects on forests. Foraging deer vacuum up seedlings, highly preferred species, reduce plant diversity, create near monocultures, and he's just talking about vegetation at this point. There's whole other cascading effects that happen once this happens that I won't go into, but there are many. And these are just some photos showing you what the browse looked like prior to us doing any deer management. This is actually a winged euonymus, an invasive plant being browsed. And it's very typical zombie geriatric forest with large old trees, zero native understory, no advanced regeneration. It was a dying forest, and we were in big trouble. And as diseases come in, like emerald ash borer, which we are being devastated by currently, bacterial leaf scorch in our red oaks, not doing anything would have been devastating. So fortunately, almost 18 years ago, we began to do something about it. Again, this one photo shows, our major issue, our Asian invasive species, Japanese stiltgrass, Japanese barberry, wineberry, very common when I first started. In 1999, we installed an exclusionary fencing around about 640 acres of our property known as the park. At that point, there was deer inside, so I wouldn't necessarily call it an exclusionary fencing, but at that time, the goal was in the future to figure it out. But we did 640 acre deer exposure, and within that 640 acre deer exposure, we did a 30 acre deer exposure, which we did remove the deer from. So we had various ages of things to research. I won't go into the details, but for a while we did some trap and transfer, over 300 deer prior to being able to do lethal measurements. And our populations still continued to grow. So we were not keeping up with the fecundity of the deer, which is really hard to do, as anyone who's ever managed deer. So in 2004, we were finally able to convince our board to allow us to take lethal action. And we had a saturation hunt, management hunt with 70 hunters. We also used a sharpshooter, professional sharpshooter inside that 640 acre exposure, as we had staff members living on site, and the sensitivity of all that. We wanted to make sure that we were temporarily separating people and rifles. So we used a sharpshooter for that, and he removed, and his crew removed 230 deer in 3 nights and brought the population down to 0 inside the fence. The 70 plus controlled management hunters we used the first year harvested around 400. So in the first year, we removed over 600 plus deer of that 1,000 deer population. We use as many tools as we say. That's why we call it an integrated plan. Here in New Jersey, we have very liberal bag limits. take limits. We have unlimited doe permits. We don't have any, we have no restrictions on how many does we harvest. We use agriculture depredation permits since we have a large agricultural component. We are allowed to get permits to shoot deer off season, off hours, and in the dark, etc. And one of our most successful things that we do to bolster our controlled management is we do organized deer drives every season during shotgun season, in which we probably harvest nearly 40% of our take every year within a 3 or 4 day period. So they're highly successful. One of the things I do for the team is I actually set harvest goals based on, we do a FLIR. For the first 15 years, it was with a fixed wing plane. Now we're using drones, much cheaper, just as effective and just as accurate. But basically, I put the population into this demographic thing that I vetted with several wildlife professionals across the country, and just to get an estimate of how many deer we want to harvest a year, and just to keep everyone to keep in mind, just to maintain a status quo of herd size, you need to reduce your herd by 40% of your start pre-fawning estimates. So I usually set the target at 50 plus, and we usually do, over the last 10 or so years, we've been able to achieve that. Just a graphic example of what our population per square mile looked like over the years, from beginning to, I guess, 2 years ago, where we're down to 23 deer per square mile. Okay, enough about the deer management. What the heck happened with the vegetation? That's what we're really here about. That's why we're managing deer. We're not managing deer because they're evil. They are part of the system. They do provide services for the environment, but at obviously much different levels than they are currently. And this picture is a beautiful example of what our early spring forest looked like back in the day before deer management. A carpet of ranunculus ficaria and barberry and all other bunch of nonsense. We studied the vegetation in 2 different ways. We studied it locally, and then we compared it also to historical data, which I'll get into later. But this first part focuses on Duke Farms itself. I'm not going to go too much into the details. I did share the paper with Scenic Hudson, and that's on some of the sites if anyone wants to dig into it deeper. If I don't really want to run through what the methodology was, but basically we're measuring. I'll have to go to the next slide. It's probably easier to see. The bottom left is a forest seshi board. We call it a seshi board. It's very similar to what they do in water quality, kind of. Basically, it's within the browse zone of a deer, and we look at invasive versus non-native, native plants versus invasive plants in those cells. We basically take a point that we return to every 3 to 5 years, and we go in the 4 cardinal directions, and we measure those little I can't remember the size of the plots, but in each cardinal direction, we do both of these measurements and record the data. And this picture is taken in the same exact location, very manicured, kind of in heavily browsed and manicured area on the left. You can see the advanced forest regeneration. That is not, no planting was done. This is all just the seed rain. Okay, so here we go. It's a nitty-gritty here. The native species, woody species. This is we began the vegetation surveys in 2008. Unfortunately, we couldn't get our act together in the first 4 years to begin this. We had to develop a system for doing it, so it took us 4 years to develop it, unfortunately. But we did miss 4 years of data, and it made some of the work kind of sticky, but we figured it all out. And you can see here the native species, woody plant species in the exposed areas increased from 23% to 70%, an average of almost 5% per year. And even on the exterior, similar to what Bill saw, there is an increase, but a much slower rate, 6 to 26, so about 2%. Non-native species also increased in the exposure and outside the exposure, actually at a higher rate in the exposure, probably due to the least amount of deer, less deer in there. And these increases were primarily from multiflora rows, which are browsed by deer, believe it or not, even though they're thorny as heck. They do browse quite a bit of the young growth and the shoots. The next slide shows graminoids. Am I on the right slide? Yes, graminoids. So native species pretty much stayed the same inside and out because they're not preferred browse by deer. So you would expect that not much would change, even with the different deer densities. However, the non-native grass species, you'll see in the exposure decreased from 52% to 25%. And that decrease is almost primarily from the advanced, the abundant regrowth of young trees and shrubs, which creates a huge shade barrier for the growth of Japanese stiltgrass. You need I have a former friend that I went to graduate school with who studied Japanese stiltgrass in the region. And some of his studies showed that you need up to almost 90% shade to eliminate stiltgrass. So you need a pretty dense regrowth, but you can see that red curve sloping down. And that's actually great because we do not manage stiltgrass. It's almost impossible to manage stiltgrass. But if we can use ecology to manage stiltgrass, even better, no herbicides, just by managing the deer and allowing the forest to function properly, you can get some control of these invasive plants. Herbaceous species, slight uptick inside the exposure, a slight decrease as you would expect maybe on the outside. And non-native species in the exposure also went up, again, because less deer exposure. And the reason that the data shows that primarily the increase in these non-native species, Japanese honeysuckle runners. As a deer hunter myself, I know that in the wintertime when things are getting rough for deer, if you can find patches of honeysuckle, you'll find deer browsing it. So that's the reason for the uptake in that inside the deer fence. And this is a graphic kind of depiction of what you see in our forest. This is a young developing forest of hickory seedlings and other things with stiltgrass underneath, as I said earlier. And if the next slide shows a more advanced age growth of those plants and some hickory and other species, and you'll see the stiltgrass has been virtually eliminated at this level of shade. Again, some more advanced regeneration choking out this Japanese barberry, which is now dead. I've gone back and taken the picture. So my point of showing all these pictures is that, yes, active restoration and invasive species control is important, but it won't ever level off unless we do something about the deer management, the deer population, and allow the natural forest regeneration to help us along the way. There's that picture I showed you earlier and what happened once we removed it and the deer were removed. Unfortunately, most of that regrowth you see on the right side is young ash seedlings, which may or may not survive the onslaught that we're currently under. The second part of the data that we collected was to compare across the region. We worked with Dr. Jay Kelly from a local community college, also someone who I went to graduate school with, who's one of the leading ecologists in the state studying these things. Him and his students recorded stem density and heights of tree seedlings and saplings and compared these with historical and regional data sets as benchmarks to gauge the extent of forest recovery at Duke Farms. So the initial set of data was collected in 2016 and 17. 5 plots were inside the fence, 5 were outside the exposure. You can see the dark blue, the categories from small seedlings to large seedlings. Small seedlings are less than 30 centimeters tall. Large seedlings are greater than or equal to 30 centimeters tall and less than 2.5 centimeters in DBH. And saplings are 2.5 centimeters to 10 centimeters. So it's a scale going small to large, left to right. You can see that small seedlings are much higher than the exposure than the, not much higher, but higher than the regional, current regional, but much lower than historic. And then if you look at the large seedlings where we kind of have this like snake eating a prey kind of bubble moving from left to right, if we had done this earlier, we would have seen that dark blue bar much higher. But now we've advanced several years and we're into the next size class, which is large seedlings. And you can see the exposure versus the regional, the Piedmont regional to the left of it exceeds, that's the current situation around us. It's even beyond the historic Piedmont and all the historic sites. So we do have a huge growth of this class, the seed class, this tree class. And even the outside the exposure, you can see it kind of almost is comparable to historic Piedmont. And when we say historic, we're referring to the most of these data were collected from regional data sets before deer were a problem. And the saplings you can see obviously have not caught up. We're not gotten to that size class yet, but the next slide will show kind of where we are a couple of years after the first initial setup. You see that how many more small seedlings we have. We've now jumped up past the historic Piedmont where we're located, and you can see as it moves to left to right, the size classes are now catching up with some of the historic data. So hunting deer is working when it comes to at least tree seedlings. And this is my final photo that I'll end on. This is a local forest patch that has not been disturbed. They consider it one of the older forest patches in New Jersey, and you can see the full gamut of what we're trying to achieve as far as stratification of a forest vertically from ground up to the large tree seedlings, large trees with large abundant shrub cover. That's one of the problems that we are still seeing at Duke Farms because of the decades of herbivory of super abundant deer populations. We didn't have any seed sources to replace the shrubs. So we are actively growing native shrubs in our nursery on the farm, and we're actively restoring populations. To give you an example, historic data showed that 40% of the forest in this area was covered by maple leaf viburnum. 20 years ago, I was able to find 3 maple leaf viburnums on 2,700 acres. And the only reason they survived is because they were inside of a dog pen and not accessible to deer. Over the last 12 years, those 3 plants have spread across 7 acres and are now becoming a little bit more dominant. So it's pretty nice to see this slowly happening. But again, my point of it is that Duke Farms is probably ground zero for the perfect storm of habitat degradation, a long land use history of disturbed soils, cleared forests, wealthy benefactors who traveled the globe and brought back exotic plants from across the globe, planted them across the property, and never allowed for deer management. We probably were 2 decades ahead of New Jersey having high deer populations. So if we can do it, I'm telling you, anyone can do it, especially you guys in the that have a problem, but not quite the same problem as we have. I gave a very similar talk years ago up in Vermont, and they were laughing at me like, "There's no problems." Like I said, it's coming. You wait and see. If you don't take care of it now, you're going to see maybe not as extreme issues that we have, but it's there. The impacts are there. And with that, I'll take any questions.
Great, thank you so much, Tom. That was really interesting. And I'll just say for myself that I've been reading your paper the past couple of days when I have time, and I'm really enjoying it because I've been thinking about deer management potential for our properties. So thank you so much for sharing that.
Great.
We have about 5 minutes for questions, and then we'll have a 5-minute break, which folks can stay and ask questions then too if they'd like, but we'll give people a chance to take a minute. So I will look through the questions that we have now. For you, Tom, the first question is, can you comment on jumping worm abundance inside and out of the exclosures if they were present?
We have not seen those worms yet on our property. Not to say they're not there, but we have not indicated that they're around yet.
Okay, thanks. Do you have any idea if you would anticipate them getting through the exclosure as it's built?
Yeah, I'm sure they'll show up. Everything else shows up at Duke Farm. So we've
Okay.
identified almost 90 different invasive plant species that are naturalized. You name it. So I wouldn't be surprised.
Great, thank you. All right, our next question is from Matt Kennedy. He asks, how often are FLIR drone flights for deer population conducted? And are they relatively accurate compared to other population count methods?
Good question. Just so everyone knows, FLIR stands for forward-looking infrared. Uses infrared technology. Again, the plane or drone or whatever methodology, helicopter is being used, they fly a transect across the property. We do it once a year. Usually, depending upon, it used to be a little bit more difficult because we hired a gentleman from Ohio to come out with this plane. Now it's a little bit easier. We use a local team to run transects with the drone, which we actually do have been able to do more frequently, 4 times a year. Prior to that, we've done it annually, but this past 3 years we've done it January, February, March, and April before leaf up on our property to see how the populations and where they're hanging out on the property, so we can inform ourselves where we can focus our efforts better.
And Tom, the second part of that question was, do you have any thought on how accurate is?
Accuracy, yeah. Most of the literature says it's one of the most accurate. We did write a paper years ago comparing it to distance sampling, roadside sampling, to trail camera trapping. They all have their uses for a property as large as ours, and not everyone can afford to do it. Obviously, the plane was very expensive, roughly $8,000 a year to do the nearly 3,000 acres. To do the 4 different surveys with the drone, or it says half price. So you can imagine if I did it once, it would be very affordable. But the accuracy in the literature is pretty good, and it's most of the accuracy is within 95% confidence interval. So we feel pretty accurate, and our numbers show that as we harvested and followed the trends throughout the year.
Great, thank you so much. I'm going to group another question with this one before we move into a slightly different topic. Bill Schuster asks, in our less productive area, our threshold below which we get tree regeneration is about 15 deer per square mile. Can you estimate the comparable threshold density in your area?
Sure. I think for tree regeneration, I would say it's probably in that range of 15, but probably we do see a little bit, we have pretty productive areas, and they're probably around 25 to 30. We start to see some regeneration. There's still some impacts for sure, negative impacts, and slower, obviously, than inside the fence, where it was deer free first until Hurricane Sandy, and then we had 87 breaches in our fence, and we've had a hard time managing the deer because it's so dense inside there. But the average density inside the fence is around 10 to 15 per square foot, whereas outside it's anywhere from 25 to 35 on a given year, depending on if we have EHD around or whatever. And the regeneration is there, but it's not quite as robust as inside.
Great, thank you. Another question from Elijah Goodwin asks, can you comment on the management of invasive species within deer exclosures? And I'm interpreting that probably as vegetation, Elijah. If that's not correct, let me know.
Say it one more time. I'm sorry.
So can you comment on the management of invasive species within deer exclosures? And I'm assuming that's plants.
Sure. Like I said, there are some impacts by having less deer. We are seeing an increase in certain things like honeysuckle and multiflora rose. But I think it gives us better areas to target. Obviously, we see most of this stuff on edges or in canopy gaps where it's more of an issue. We are beginning to gain ecological control with the shading and a lot of those species. We do actively focus on EDRR species, early detection, rapid response. So those are species that are new either to the area or to the property that aren't established, and we want to get rid of those before they do get established, or whether they threaten conservation targets is where we focus most of our effort. I have a very small restoration staff of about 2, so and we target what we can.
Great, thank you. So this is going to be the last question before the break. There is one more after this, so I'm happy to stay on and facilitate if anyone wants to hang in. But for this last question, it's sort of relevant to your last comment there, Tom. Do you have any analysis of the costs of running your program, deer management, population measurements, field inventories, et cetera? Can land trusts or small land organizations afford this kind of management, or is it very expensive?
Sure. If you're just speaking of management itself, the actual deer management, not the tracking of vegetation, I can give you a better estimate of that. But so for deer management, we are allowed to bait in New Jersey. So we do provide bulk corn for our hunters, which costs us roughly around $2,500 a year. The FLIR probably costs us around $4,000, which you don't have to do. There are cheaper methodologies if you have volunteers to do distance sampling and those kind of things and road counts. But you shouldn't go into it blindly, I think, and just manage deer without knowing essentially kind of what your population level is at. But I think land trusts can do it. Especially we're doing it at a very large scale, right? 3,000, almost 3,000 square miles. We're bigger than some towns in our county. So most land trusts are probably either a bunch of little parcels, which makes it a little bit more challenging because you're not able to kind of handle what's going on around your borders. We even see that on a large property where land that abuts us is not being properly managed for deer. They're buck hunting, which doesn't really help us at all. But I do think it's affordable. I mean, I think there's plenty of land trust in New Jersey and local communities like Hopewell Valley Open Space is doing a town-wide program. It's not quite as successful as it could be because of so much, when it comes to private land ownership and different land ownerships, it becomes a little bit more challenging. I have a unique situation where as does Bill, where we can kind of focus on our own properties, which is a very different thing. But I think it's definitely, I don't think you should not try it, even if you don't have all those bells and whistles with FLIR and paying for bait. And a lot of places charge hunters to hunt. I'm one of the few that doesn't.
Great, thank you so much.